In this video, I've got 3 stories about people who made choices they can't take back, and what they did afterward might be even more disturbing than the choices themselves. If you're into real stories that are unsettling, mysterious, and a little hard to believe, you're definitely in the right place. Stick around, and if you enjoy this kind of content, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's coming next. The night the 911 operator hung up first. By the time the operator understood that the caller was answering too late, the line had already gone quiet once, then opened again on its own with a soft scrape, as if the receiver had been lifted by a hand that did not know what a telephone was supposed to sound like. The county dispatch room sat behind the sheriff's office in a low building of painted cinder block with one narrow window facing a gravel lot and the black outline of the hills beyond. At that hour, there was only one operator on duty, a woman who had worked the night shift long enough to know the different silences of the county. There was the silence of winter roads after midnight, when even the logging trucks were gone. There was the silence that came before a domestic call, when breathing filled the line but nobody wanted to speak first. And there was the silence of open land, old houses, and telephone wires stretched across hollows where the dark seemed to collect and stay. The call that came in just after 3 o'clock in the morning did not match any of those. The first part of the recording, according to later reports, was incomplete. The county's equipment was old even then, and pieces of incoming audio were known to drop out or distort. What survived began with the operator identifying the line and asking what the emergency was. For a few seconds, there was nothing but a faint rushing sound. Then, a man's voice, distant and thinned by static, said that he needed help. The operator asked him to repeat himself. There was another delay. Then, in the same voice, a little closer this time, he said that something was outside his house. It would not have been unusual by itself. In that part of West Virginia, people called for bears in the yard, strangers on porches, headlights lingering too long at the end of a drive. The operator asked for the address. What made the call strange was not the fear in the man's voice, but the pattern. Each time she asked a question, there was a pause just a little too long to sound natural, followed by an answer that seemed to come not from someone thinking, but from someone listening first. Not to her, to something else. She asked for the address again. A long hush followed. The tape held a faint clicking, not unlike an extension line being lifted somewhere else in the house. Then the man said, carefully, as if repeating words fed to him, that he was at the old route house beyond the creek crossing near the county line. The operator knew the place only vaguely. Rural callers often gave directions instead of house numbers. She asked for a name. Another pause. This time, the answer came wrong. The voice gave the address again, almost word for word, but slower. The operator corrected him, asked again for his name, and when the reply came, it arrived with the same soft delay as if it had crossed a room before entering the mouth that spoke it. According to people who later heard the recording, that was the moment her tone changed. It did not break, she did not panic, but the steadiness flattened. She began speaking more distinctly, as operators are trained to do with frightened callers, and she asked whether the man was alone in the house. The tape carried a low shuffling sound. A hinge moved somewhere. The caller did not answer at first. Then he whispered that he thought so. Outside the dispatch room, nothing moved. The sheriff's deputies were covering a wide area that night, one on a traffic stop near the highway and another farther south on a welfare check. The operator started one unit toward the caller's area, then kept the man talking as best she could. She asked what he could hear. The caller said there had been knocking at the back door for almost an hour. Not loud, not trying to get in, only patient. 3 taps. Then nothing, then 3 taps again. He said his dogs had gone under the kitchen table and would not come out. The operator asked whether he could lock himself in a room. The delay came again. Then the man said, in the same careful tone, that he had already done that. It should have reassured her. It did the opposite. The room sound on the call did not match a closed bedroom or a bathroom. Even through the poor quality of the tape, there was an openness to it, the soft hollow of a larger space. She asked which room he was in. There was no answer. Then, faintly, another voice could be heard. People disagree about that part. Some later said it was only feedback or the warble of bad equipment. Others believed there were two people on the line, one farther from the receiver. The surviving audio is not clear enough to prove either version. But several who reviewed the report said the operator reacted as though she heard something she could not place because she stopped speaking for a moment, then asked very quietly whether anyone else was in the room with him. Nothing. Static. A single, dull tap. Then the man answered no. A deputy reached the road nearest the property several minutes later and radioed that the house sat back from the lane at the end of a washed-out drive with no outside lights on. The operator relayed this to the caller, telling him help was almost there. For the first time, the voice on the line seemed to respond without the strange delay. It said thank you immediately with such abrupt relief that she must have felt some easing in her chest. Then, after a pause, the voice added that something had just moved in the hallway. What followed is one of the details repeated most often in retellings of the incident. The operator told the caller not to leave the room, not to make any noise, and to stay on the line. The tape captured a slow creaking sound that might have been floorboards or the receiver shifting in a hand gone damp with sweat. Then there came a series of very soft knocks. Not from the back door, not distant, close. So close that the sound seemed to come through the telephone itself. 3 taps. A pause. 3 taps again. The operator spoke the caller's name, or what she believed was his name from an earlier garbled exchange. There was no answer. Instead, she heard breathing, but it no longer sounded frightened. It sounded measured, curious, the kind of breath someone takes while listening through a wall. The deputy outside radioed that he was approaching the porch. The operator told the caller deputies were entering the property. The line stayed open. In the recording, a new noise emerged then, one that investigators later described only as movement near the mouthpiece. Cloth brushing plastic, a fingernail or ring striking the handset once. Then the man's voice returned, but farther away than before. So far away, it seemed to come from the end of a hall. It said, with that same odd care, do not let them knock. The operator asked what he meant. The voice did not answer. The deputy, now at the door, reported no lights, no response, and no sign of forced entry. The operator told him the caller might be hiding inside. She stayed on the line and asked the man if he could hear the deputy outside. This time, the delay was longer than any before, long enough that she repeated the question. Then the voice said yes. But the deputy radioed at that same moment that he had not knocked yet. After that, the surviving record becomes more confused. One report says the operator asked the caller whether he could see whoever was outside his room. Another says she asked whether there was a second phone in the house. Either way, what matters is that the answer came back before she had finished speaking, not after. It arrived on top of her words in a low murmur, as though whatever was listening had finally learned the timing. Witnesses later claimed that the operator pulled the headset slightly away from one ear at that moment. She would not discuss it in detail afterward. All she ever admitted was that she became certain, for reasons she could not cleanly explain, that the man who had placed the call was no longer the one speaking to her. Whether that belief came from the pacing of the responses, the change in breathing, or the simple animal feeling that something had shifted on the line, nobody could say. The deputy entered through an unlocked back door. He swept the kitchen first. 2 dogs were found under the table, pressed so far back against the wall that he had to crouch to see their eyes. A chair had been overturned near the sink. The phone on the kitchen wall hung in its cradle. The cord was still untouched. There was no one in the room, no obvious sign that a call had been made from there. The operator heard him moving from room to room over the radio, while the line in her headset remained open, full of soft breathing and the faintest scrape, as if the caller were dragging one finger across wallpaper. The deputy checked a sitting room, then a narrow hallway, then the front room facing the road. No one. He reported a damp footprint on the hall floor, but only one, too smeared to judge clearly and odd in shape. Before the operator could ask more, the voice on her line spoke again. It asked whether the deputy was alone. She did not answer. Later, according to coworkers, she said the question felt less like fear and more like appetite. The training manuals on her desk, the illuminated buttons, the buzzing fluorescent light overhead, All the ordinary objects around her began to seem very far away. She pressed her hand against the edge of the console to steady herself and told the deputy to exit the house immediately. He demanded a reason. She did not give one. She only repeated the order, sharper this time. By then, the second deputy had arrived outside. The first deputy began backing toward the kitchen. As he moved, he radioed that one bedroom door at the end of the hall was shut. He said he had not opened it yet because he thought he heard movement inside. The operator closed her eyes for one brief second. When she spoke again, she told him not to open it. The deputy asked why. She said she had the caller on the line, and the caller was not in that room. Nobody ever produced a perfectly satisfying explanation for what happened next. The first deputy ignored her and opened the bedroom door. Inside, according to official notes, the room was empty except for a bed, a lamp, and a small table with a second telephone lying on its side. The line to that phone had been cut, not recently, but sometime before, the copper darkened, the outer sheath dry with dust. On the bedspread, close to the pillow, was an impression deep enough to suggest weight had rested there for a long while. The window above the bed stood open to the black yard behind the house. And from the dispatcher's headset, all at once, there came the sound of knocking again. Not 3 taps this time. 1. Then another, heavier, resonant, and close, like a fist striking wood from the inside. The operator tore the headset off. That was the part people remembered, because operators did not do that. They were trained to stay with a caller through almost anything. But she let the headset fall against the console, and the room microphone picked up enough of the open line for others nearby to hear a voice continuing to speak from the earpiece. Not loudly, not clearly. Just enough to make the hair rise along the necks of the people who later described it. No suspect was found on the property, no caller was identified with certainty. The house belonged, according to county records, to an elderly man who had died some months earlier, though neighbors reportedly claimed a relative came and went from time to time. Some said they had seen a light in the place within the last week. Others insisted it had been empty much longer than that. The available reports do not settle the question. The audio itself remained incomplete, with segments missing at the beginning and end, and some portions badly degraded. What did enter local memory, and stay there, was not the paperwork, but the pattern. The operator had received a call from a house where no working phone appeared to have placed it. She had spoken to a man whose identity could not be pinned down. She had realized, before the deputies did, that the voice answering her questions was changing. And at the moment when trained instinct should have kept her calm and connected, she had done the one thing dispatchers were not supposed to do. She hung up first. Afterwards, she worked only day shifts for a while. Then, not long after, she left the county job entirely. People who knew her said she never liked to discuss the case, though one former coworker remembered her saying that what frightened her was not the possibility of a prank or even a person hiding in the house. It was the delay. The voice always seemed to wait, she said, as though someone else in the room had to hear the question before the answer could be given. In the hills, stories rarely stay fixed. They gather weather and rumor. By the time the tale had traveled through diners, porches, gas stations, and late kitchen conversations, it had changed shape the way all local legends do. Some said the caller had been dead before the phone ever rang. Some said there had been a prowler moving through abandoned houses, lifting receivers, and listening to people breathe. Some said the open bedroom window faced a patch of ground where no grass had grown right for years. And some claimed that on damp nights, if the lines were bad and the county was quiet, dispatchers still heard an extra click before certain calls connected, like someone in another room picking up an extension and saying nothing. None of that was ever proved. But in rural counties, proof does not always kill a story. Sometimes the uncertainty feeds it. A deputy who later retired told the story only once in public, at a civic supper, and even then he avoided the worst parts. He said the thing he remembered most was not the bedroom, or the cut phone line, or the dogs under the table. It was stepping back onto the porch after searching the house and seeing the operator's patrol lights spill across the yard while all the woods beyond remained perfectly still. No wind, no insects. No movement in the trees, just that stillness, deep and watchful, as if the hillside itself had been listening to the call. Years later, people still argued over the details. They argued about the missing seconds on the tape, about whether there had truly been a second voice, about whether the house was occupied, about whether the operator's instincts had saved a deputy from walking deeper into something human or something worse. Those arguments never resolved anything. They only kept the story breathing. And the last part, the quietest part, lingered longest. When the supervisor reviewed the damaged recording near dawn, after the deputies had cleared the scene and the sun had not yet reached the valley, there was almost nothing left at the end. Just static, a faint shift of plastic against a desk, and the soft click of the operator disconnecting the line. Then, beneath it, so faint it could easily have been tape noise, there seemed to be one final sound. Not a voice. Not exactly. More like someone very close to the mouthpiece, learning how to whisper after the call was already over. The last time anyone heard from Emily Carter. The phone was not supposed to be moving anymore. By the fourth night after Emily Carter disappeared, the search teams had already walked the creek beds, the drainage ditches, the gravel roads that lifted out into the dark fields north of town. Deputies had checked the usual places first, then the less usual ones. They had spoken to the man at the gas station, the woman who claimed she saw Emily near the highway shoulder, the couple who said they heard a car door slam sometime after midnight. The public updates grew thinner with each passing day. The first photographs began to fade from storefront windows. But just after midnight, according to reports later discussed by people close to the case, Emily's phone connected to a nearby tower again. Not far away, not out in another state, not gone. Just there, somewhere in the dark, as if it had only just been switched on by a patient hand. Northern Colorado has long stretches where sound travels too clearly at night. A dog barking 3 properties over can seem close enough to touch. Wind moving through dry grass can sound like whispering in a room that should be empty. The roads outside the smaller towns run between irrigation ditches, storage sheds, old fencing, and fields that flatten under moonlight until distance becomes difficult to judge. It was in a place like that, people said, where Emily had last been seen. Not in a dramatic way, not running, not screaming, just present, and then no longer present. What could be confirmed publicly was sparse. Emily had gone missing after an ordinary evening by every outward measure. There was no sign of a struggle that authorities chose to describe in detail. Her vehicle, according to discussion that followed, was not found abandoned on some lonely road in the way people first imagined. The confusion started almost immediately. One witness said she left alone. Another said she had been arguing with someone in a parking lot lit by weak amber bulbs. A third insisted she looked calm, distracted if anything, as though listening for something outside the frame of conversation. None of it aligned cleanly. The accounts overlapped in shape and not in substance, the way stories do when people want badly to be useful and fear what their own memory might have missed. By the second day, volunteers were driving slow loops through the county roads with their windows cracked, calling her name into culverts and shelter belts and the mouths of abandoned farm buildings. Flyers went up in laundromats, diners, and feed stores. The usual machinery of concern began to turn. Family members made statements. Friends repeated the same careful phrases into local microphones. She would not have vanished on purpose. She was not the sort of person to disappear. She would have called, she would have answered. It was the kind of language people use when trying to build a wall against the dark, as if the right sequence of facts could keep something unreal from becoming permanent. Then came the first mention of the phone. Not an answered call, not a message, only a connection. A small thing, technical and bloodless on paper. Her device had reached a tower sometime late at night, then gone silent again. Searchers shifted their attention toward the area suggested by the signal. Roads were checked, empty lots were checked, water was checked, ditches were checked twice. Nothing. The ground gave back no shoe, no coat, no bag, no clean explanation. And when morning came, the land looked exactly as it had the day before. Wide and ordinary and untroubled by what people were beginning to fear it was hiding. The late-night tower connections might have remained a detail buried inside the case if they had happened only once, but according to people who followed the disappearance closely, it happened again. Then again, each time well after dark. each time brief enough to feel accidental, deliberate, or both. The phone would appear near the same cluster of towers and then vanish before anyone could reach anything that might be called a scene. To some investigators, if reports are to be believed, it suggested movement within a limited area. To others, it suggested a device powered on intermittently by someone who knew just enough to create uncertainty. But uncertainty, once it settles into a town, does not stay professional for long. It seeps under doors, it rides home with the volunteers, it sits in kitchens after the television has gone dark. People began checking their own windows at night. A waitress from a roadside place said she had served Emily coffee earlier that week and remembered her because she kept glancing at the door as if waiting for someone who made her uneasy. A ranch hand swore he saw a light moving near an unused service road close to midnight, low to the ground at first and then higher, as if someone had lifted a phone and turned slowly in a circle. A teenager told deputies he heard a ringtone drifting over the irrigation canal while he was parked with friends, but nobody in the car agreed on what the sound had been. Even within a single memory, things were splitting apart. That was when older stories began to attach themselves to the case the way burrs catch on clothing. There are places in northern Colorado where the newest silence lies over older absences. The old farmhouses with sunken porches, the motels that stand too far from the interstate to be useful now, the barns that look empty from the road until moonlight finds glass where no glass should be. Residents always have stories, though most of them are not told in daylight. A woman gone from a service station near closing time, a hunter who left his truck and did not come back before first snow, lights seen moving through fallow fields long after the nearest house had gone dark. None of it proved anything. None of it needed to. In a place that keeps its distances, rumor becomes a second weather. Emily's case became the center these stories drifted toward. Her friends were said to be exhausted by the contradictions. One of them told a local reporter, in the careful voice of someone trying not to become part of the spectacle, that the worst part was not the not knowing, it was the false almosts. Each late-night signal felt like proof that an answer was nearby. Each morning erased it. Some nights they stayed awake, dressed and ready, waiting to hear that searchers had found her alive in some outbuilding or stranded on some back road. Instead, there would be another clipped update, another request for tips, another statement that the investigation was active and ongoing. The language remained steady even as everyone listening to it began to hear the hollowness underneath. One volunteer, according to local discussion afterward, had driven the area of the strongest signal alone after midnight despite being asked not to. He took a county road lined with bare cottonwoods and followed it until pavement became packed dirt. There were no houses for a while, then one old place set back from the road with no porch light, no visible vehicle, and plywood over one of the windows. He later said he stopped because he thought he saw a pale rectangle moving behind the glass, bright for a second, then gone. When he rolled down his window, he heard nothing at first, except the ticking of his own engine cooling. Then, very faintly, a vibration. Not a ringtone exactly. More like a phone set to silent and left on a hard surface somewhere inside the dark. He did not go in. He told himself he was being foolish. He drove back toward town and reported it the next day, ashamed of how uncertain he sounded even to himself. By then, the phone had connected on another night. Always late, always brief, always enough. Technicians could explain the basics. A device could wake for many reasons. Battery fluctuations, environmental interference, limited handshakes with the network, delayed behavior not always meaningful to a layperson. People repeated these explanations because they needed them. But explanations only work as far as the pattern allows. This pattern did not spread out randomly across daylight hours. It did not drift county to county. It happened at night, in a narrow band of darkness, as if something waited for the town to become still before letting the signal rise. The most disturbing detail never appeared in any official release, but it survived in conversation because it had the shape of something that should not be true. According to those who claim to know, Emily's voicemail changed sometime after the disappearance, not the greeting itself, the space after it. Callers began to say there was a sound underneath the silence, So faint they first mistook it for the hiss of a poor connection. Then, one of Emily's cousins listened to it more than once and said it sounded like wind passing through a narrow opening with a hollow knock at uneven intervals, as though something loose were striking wood somewhere nearby. Another person insisted there was breathing, another said they heard water. Each listener found a different horror inside the same static. That may have been grief, it may have been suggestion, but after that, some family friends stopped calling altogether. The witness statements only grew stranger as they were repeated. The woman who believed she had seen Emily by the highway later said she was no longer sure it had been Emily at all, only someone with the same light jacket and the same habit of holding one arm close to her body when cold. The couple who reported a car door after midnight began arguing over whether the sound had actually been farther away than they first claimed. The man at the gas station changed one detail in a way that unsettled everyone who noticed. At first, he said Emily looked tired. Later, he said she looked as though she had been crying. Then, in a quieter interview that circulated among locals more than it aired publicly, he said she had looked frightened for only a second and that the fear had not been directed at anyone in the store. It had been aimed through the front window toward the darkness outside. No suspect was clearly named in the public imagination because the facts would not stay still long enough to support one. That left room for the older American habit of filling blank spaces with place, with atmosphere, with whatever had frightened the town before this latest absence arrived. People pointed to the isolated structures beyond the main roads. They spoke of storage units, disused farm equipment, sheds, hunting cabins no one checked until deep winter. Some remembered older cases from other states, stories of missing people whose belongings lingered longer in the landscape than their bodies did. Others spoke more softly, and only at home, about the way certain roads seemed to collect trouble. A person could drive them 100 times in daylight and feel nothing. Then, one night, the same road would seem to turn its face and show some other character entirely. Searchers kept going. They searched by morning and by dusk. They searched on foot and in vehicles. They searched places no one wanted to search. The weather shifted in small Colorado ways, cold enough before dawn to sting the lungs, then thin sunlight over the fields, then evening coming on too quickly. Boots pressed new patterns into mud that dried and cracked by the next day. Tape fluttered where officers had marked off areas and then, once cleared, removed themselves from them. In photographs taken from the roadside, the landscape looked open. Standing inside it was different. Inside it, every ditch had depth. Every cluster of trees held shadow long after the rest of the ground had gone pale. A deputy was said to have remarked, off the record and long after, that the worst searches were the ones conducted in nearly complete silence. Not because silence was eerie in itself, but because it changed the rhythm of expectation. A person walking through brush begins to hear every small disturbance as meaningful. A scrape becomes a footstep. A bird lifting out of weeds becomes movement. The mind begins to prepare for discovery over and over, and each time it finds only more land. Emily's search, by those accounts, had that feeling. Not dramatic, not cinematic, only prolonged, cold disappointment broken at intervals by the tiny cruelty of electronic hope. Then a rancher reported seeing a light. He was closing a gate not far from one of the tower areas when he noticed a glow in the distance, low and blue-white, blinking between stands of scrub. He assumed at first it was another volunteer, though by then official searches had been scaled back at night. The light vanished, reappeared farther along, vanished again. He called out once, no answer. By the time he reached the fence line nearest the glow, it was gone. He later said what unsettled him most was not the distance or the darkness, but the height of it. Too low for someone walking with a flashlight. About right, he thought afterward, for a phone being carried loosely at thigh level. After that report, people began keeping track of the time, just after midnight. A little before 1 a.m., closer to 2 on one occasion, depending on which account was believed. The pattern narrowed into ritual. It was as if Emily's disappearance had not ended in a single moment, but was still occurring in fragments every night. A signal, a light, a sound, then nothing by dawn. Emily's mother, according to people close to the family, stopped sleeping in her bedroom and moved to the living room sofa because it was nearer the front window. She did not say she expected Emily to come walking up the driveway. She was too practical for language like that. But practical people also leave lamps on for reasons they do not discuss. She kept her phone on the coffee table with the sound turned high. She answered every unknown number. Sometimes she would wake certain she had heard the vibration of a call and find the screen dark, the room washed in that thin pre-dawn color that makes furniture look abandoned. Once, very late, she reportedly received a burst of silence long enough to make her say Emily's name twice into the line before the connection dropped. Whether it was a real event, a wrong number, or a story changed by repetition is impossible to say. In missing person cases, grief does not merely remember, it edits. The house Emily had left behind became another quiet center of the case. Friends came and went at first, gathering clothes, feeding pets if there were pets, checking drawers for anything that might help. Later, the visits slowed. The rooms settled. A cup remained where it had been set down. A charger stayed plugged into the wall with nothing attached to it. Shoes waited by a door that no longer opened for the person who had worn them. It is often the ordinary objects that make a disappearance feel least survivable. Not blood, not drama. Just a brush with hair still caught in it, a receipt folded into a coat pocket, the pale square on a nightstand where a phone used to charge before someone took it into the dark. Weeks passed, if later retellings are accurate, without the case becoming clearer. Public interest rose and fell. The flyers weathered. Tape marks on certain windows faded. New events in other places pulled attention away, but local memory held on to the tower connections because they resisted the comfort of finality. If Emily's phone had gone dead at once, people could have folded that fact into the bleak arithmetic of disappearance. Instead, it kept returning like a hand on the shoulder after everyone in the room had gone still. There was one more detail, not official, not proved, but repeated often enough that it survives wherever the case is mentioned in low voices. A utility worker doing routine checks near one of the tower zones found an old outbuilding on private land with fresh scuff marks near the threshold. Nothing dramatic, no obvious sign of forced entry. Just the feeling that the door had been opened recently despite the dust and weather on the rest of the structure. He did not go in at first because the smell coming through the gap was stale and mineral, damp wood, and cold earth. When he returned later with the property owner, the inside held only old equipment, broken shelving, and a workbench. On the bench lay a phone charger with no phone attached to it. The model was common. It proved nothing. But the owner swore it had not been there the season before. No public account ever confirmed that the charger belonged to Emily. No public statement ever tied the tower signals to a specific place. That is where truth begins to fray into the darker fabric people make to cover what they cannot bear to leave exposed. Some say investigators knew more than they released and withheld it for reasons of procedure. Some say the signals were meaningless and the town built a ghost from network noise because grief prefers a moving target to a permanent grave. Others, more quietly, say the phone was being powered on by someone who liked the idea of nearness. Someone who wanted the search to circle without landing. Someone who understood how much terror could be created by a device no larger than a hand. What remains, years later, in the way such stories are told, is not a solved ending, but a schedule of dread. Midnight settling over the county roads, empty fields silvered by moonlight, barns and sheds standing dark against the horizon, a family home with one lamp burning, search volunteers who once thought technology would bring certainty, now staring at maps that only tightened the mystery. And somewhere in that wide northern dark, according to reports and rumors that never fully died, a phone waking just long enough to remind everyone that Emily Carter had not simply vanished. Something or someone had lingered after her. Even now, locals sometimes mention that the roads around those tower zones feel wrong after midnight, not haunted in the theatrical sense, just watched, as if the land there learned the habit of waiting. Drivers passing through say they lower the radio without meaning to, They check the passenger seat for a light that is not there. They notice how often they look toward the fields. And if their own phones lose service for a moment or vibrate once without explanation, they think of the case whether they want to or not. Because the last time anyone was certain they heard from Emily Carter was not a voice, not a cry for help, not a message that could be saved and replayed. It was only a brief, cold acknowledgement from the dark. A signal touching a tower in the middle of the night, then slipping away before anyone could reach it. The kind of thing that would have meant almost nothing in another case. In this one, it was enough to keep the town listening long after the sound was gone. He reported something strange in Yosemite, then he vanished. By the time the second call came over the radio, the ranger station had already marked him as delayed. His last check-in had been thin with static, a clipped voice carried through the dark like something dragged across stone. He had said the trail was empty. He had said the campfire smoke had no source. Then, after a pause so long the dispatcher thought the signal had dropped, he added that something was moving below the tree line where nothing should have been moving at all. The trail he had been assigned to watch was one of the quieter routes in Yosemite, a long and narrowing path used mostly by experienced hikers, backcountry campers, and the occasional photographer who preferred the high silence away from the valley roads. It was the kind of place where a person could walk for hours without hearing another voice. The incident reports from that stretch were ordinary most of the time. Twisted ankles, lost gear, improper food storage. Once in a while, someone would claim they had heard footsteps outside their tent and found no tracks in the morning. But reports like that were usually set aside with a line about nerves, wind, or distant wildlife moving after dark. Even so, there had been enough strange complaints over the years to give that trail a reputation among seasonal staff. A few hikers had described hearing slow movement in the brush far above them in places too steep for a person to climb and too bare to hide a bear. One couple said they watched stones roll down from an exposed ledge and expected to see a deer or mountain lion at the top, but nothing appeared. Another report mentioned a shape passing between trees after midnight, not crossing the trail, not approaching camp, only keeping pace for nearly half a mile. None of it was considered reliable. The park received stories like that every season. The mountains made distance, behaved strangely, sound traveled where it should not, shapes changed in moonlight. People came back tired and uncertain and ashamed of how frightened they had been by ordinary darkness. The ranger who went missing was not known for nerves. According to other staff, he was methodical, patient, the sort of man who wrote neat field notes even in bad weather. He had worked enough summer seasons in the Sierra to know the difference between a branch rubbing in the wind and something walking with intent. His reports were usually spare. If he said he heard a coyote, he meant a coyote. If he said he found bear sign, he gave the distance, the condition of the scat, the direction of travel, and nothing else. People later returned to that detail because of what appeared in his final log. It was not the language of a man looking for drama, it was the language of a man trying very hard not to name what he was seeing. The first call that evening had not sounded urgent. He mentioned an abandoned cooking area near a prohibited zone, then corrected himself and said it only looked abandoned. The fire ring was still warm, but there was no tent, no packs, no wrappers, no boot prints he could trust on the hard ground. Just smoke breathing out of blackened stones and a smell he could not identify. Not meat, not pine. Something damp and bitter, as if green wood had been burned with wet cloth over it. He said he would keep moving along the trail and circle back before midnight. That should have been the end of it. An hour later, he radioed again. This time, he sounded distracted. He reported hearing movement uphill from the switchbacks above the granite shelf where the slope opened into loose stone and sparse timber. That was the part of the message that lingered in old retellings. He did not say he heard an animal. He did not say he heard a person. He said movement more than once, staying parallel. Too heavy for falling rock, too deliberate for wind. Then he said the same thing had stopped whenever he stopped. The dispatcher asked whether he wanted another ranger sent out from the lower access road. There was a pause. Then came the answer, quiet enough that it almost disappeared in the static. He said no, not yet. He said he thought he had found tracks, but they made no sense. The ground was shallow, with dust and dry needles. He described depressions that seemed almost like barefoot prints, except too long, too narrow, and spaced too far apart along the edge of a wash where no one would choose to walk at night. A few moments later, he corrected himself again. He said perhaps they were not prints at all. He said he could only see them clearly when he looked away from them. By the time the moon rose over the ridge, the station had started logging his calls more carefully. Other rangers later claimed that the tone of the night changed after that point, not the forest itself. The room inside the station, radios were turned down lower, coffee went cold on the desk. A senior ranger stood over the map with one hand flat against the table, listening to empty bursts of static between transmissions. The missing ranger checked in once more and said he had reached a point overlooking a dry creek bed. He could see the pale ribbon of stone below him. He could see, or believed he could see, something shifting along it in sections as if parts of the darkness were moving separately and then joining again. When asked whether it might be a bear, he answered too quickly. No. Too low to the ground at first, he said, then too high. Search teams later found the place where he had stopped. The beam from his flashlight was discovered lying against a fallen log, still intact, though the batteries were nearly spent by then. His hat was recovered farther downslope, caught in a stand of brush. The dirt around both items offered almost nothing. No drag marks, no clear blood. No sign of struggle that anyone could point to with confidence. There were scuffs in the dust and fresh stone turned over near the creek bed, but a search area in the mountains changes quickly once boots begin crossing it. What unsettled some of the team was not what they found, but what they did not. There was no obvious path of retreat, no clean line of tracks leading away. It was as though he had set his light down to look at something and then simply ceased to have weight. His field notebook turned up the following afternoon in a shallow break in the granite, protected from the wind by chance or by placement. The earlier entries were ordinary: campsite checks, trail erosion, a note about a fallen branch blocking part of the route. Then, near the end, the writing changed. Lines slanted downward, words crowded together. He mentioned hearing stones click against each other below the ridge. He mentioned the smell returning. He wrote that the deer had gone silent long before sunset, which he found wrong for that area. Then came the line most often repeated in whispers by people who know the story only halfway. Something moving where no wildlife should have been. No antler corridor, no cover. No reason for anything living to be there. Beneath that, in smaller writing, he added that it seemed to understand the trail better than he did. There was one final entry written so quickly that some investigators later disagreed about the exact wording. Most versions say he noted a shape standing in the creek bed where moments earlier there had been nothing at all. Others believed the line described not a shape, but a section of darkness that remained after the moon moved on. The page ended with an unfinished sentence about height, not how tall it was, how high its shoulders seemed when it crossed the stone. That detail disturbed people because the creek bed offered little cover, and because anything crossing there should have made sound, should have dislodged rock, should have announced itself in one of the many ordinary ways that living things do. The notebook gave no such sound, only the statement that it was closer now. At some point after reading the notebook, members of the search team began sharing their own observations more reluctantly. One ranger admitted that during the second night of the search, he heard what sounded like slow footfalls above camp, pacing from one side of the slope to the other without ever descending. Another said he woke before dawn and saw a figure near the tree line, standing at an angle that suggested it was looking down into camp, though when he fully sat up, it was no longer there. These accounts were never treated as evidence. Officially, they remained exhausted impressions from men who had spent too many hours in cold air under too little sleep. But in the years that followed, some of those same men refused assignments on that trail after dark. The practical explanations were many and sober: a fall into a narrow crevice, a medical event in rough country, disorientation, exposure. Yosemite is not gentle to the lost, and the distance between a misstep and a disappearance can be very small in the high backcountry. Search operations in such terrain are always imperfect. Ravines hide what they take, snow arrives, water shifts debris, animals scatter what little remains. there was never enough to prove anything else. That, in a way, made the story worse. The mountain offered no conclusion, only absence, and absence has room for every kind of rumor. Still, the reports did not stop. Over the following seasons, a handful of hikers from that same corridor described odd disturbances that fit too neatly with the old notebook to be comfortable. One man claimed he heard someone walking beside him in the dark while he packed his campsite, though every time he turned his head, the sound shifted farther uphill. A pair of backpackers told staff they had seen a distant light moving below the ridge, too low and too steady to be a headlamp carried by a person. A woman who came down from the trail at dawn said she had listened to pebbles roll in short, measured bursts from the creek bed below her, as if something was crossing stone in careful steps. She waited for a deer. She waited for a bear. The creek bed stayed empty. Among local retellings, the story changed shape the way mountain stories often do. Some said the missing ranger found evidence of an illegal camp and followed the wrong people into the trees. Some said he succumbed to altitude and fear, that the notebook recorded the unraveling of a tired mind. Others, more quietly, repeated the older belief that there are places in wilderness where human pathways cut through ground that does not welcome being mapped or patrolled. In those versions, the thing on the slope was never described clearly. It did not need to be. It was enough that it moved where nothing should move, and that a man trained to recognize the ordinary world had taken one look and failed to place it inside that world at all. Years later, portions of the incident file were reportedly requested by people with no relation to the family, no legal reason, no clear purpose beyond curiosity. One former employee, speaking only in general terms, said the strangest part of reviewing the file was the radio transcript. On paper, the missing ranger sounded calm right up until the end. Not calm in the reassuring sense. Calm in the brittle sense, like someone holding still while waiting for a large animal to choose whether or not to come closer. His final transmission was broken by static and never fully recovered, but most versions agree on the last clear phrase. It is there in old copies and in the memory of those who heard it live. He said it had stepped onto the trail behind him, though he had never heard it climb. The trail remains open. People still walk it beneath clean morning light, with granite shining pale through the trees and ravens turning slowly over the ridges. Most return with photographs, sore legs, and no story worth telling. But now and then, according to rangers and hikers who speak cautiously about such things, someone comes back altered by a night they cannot explain. They describe an empty section of trail that felt occupied. They mention a smell like wet ash where no fire had burned. They admit, often with embarrassment, that they heard movement pacing them from a slope too barren to hide a living thing. Those reports are still written down in the plain language of park paperwork and filed among the ordinary troubles of the backcountry. Yet the old story remains beneath them, quiet and persistent, like water under stone, because the ranger was never found, because his light was left facing the trees. And because in the final line he ever wrote, he did not say he was being followed. He wrote that whatever had been moving out there had finally learned where the trail would take him.